Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Gruesome and Grotesque video. As always, I do these videos just randomly out of the blue. Either I come across an article that merits showcasing the information here, or I come across a suggestion that I definitely want to share here as well. In this case, it has to do with a suggestion that I was just reading that reminded me to do one that was suggested a little while back as well, at the time when I did the video involving the tragedy of Mary the Elephant. Very sad video that I had to do. I wanted to showcase her tragic tale. If you hadn't a chance to see it, I'll include the link for it below. But I remember there was a particular suggestion as well to talk about this very tragic tale involving yet another gruesome death of an elephant. And when I was reminded of it just recently as well, I decided to go ahead and share this information here. And truly, this is something just so sad, so horrific, whenever I was finding all the info tied to this poor elephant, and you'll know why here in a minute. But basically, it has to do with this. It's the tragedy of Topsy the elephant, who not only was electrocuted, but was also strangled and then poisoned to death. Pretty much all three at one when it came to their ultimate demise. So let's go ahead and let's share all this horrific information, mainly of course to make sure that Topsy the elephant's info remains out there, that no one forgets her untimely death, her unfortunate death associated with this. So here's essentially what happened. Sometime in 1875, Topsy the elephant was born somewhere in Southeast Asia, but her life pretty much took a bad turn right from the beginning, and that's because soon after she was captured by elephant traders. These elephant traders were apparently capturing elephants left and right in that area because they wanted to sell them to circuses. And the thing was this, circuses at the time were competing against one another. There was of course Barnum and Bailey Circus, but there was this other circus called Four Paws Circus that in turn was trying to make business here in the United States, and both of them were essentially battling each other out, trying to make sure that they could get the most audiences possible. And one way, of course, to do that is to have the biggest land animals on earth, elephants, within their roster, within their animals that they have there. And so these elephant traders were capturing elephants. One of them eventually was Topsy, and then she was sold to Four Paws Circus, who in turn secretly smuggled her into the United States. The way I read the information was this must have been when she was really young. In other words, just a youngling when it came to being an elephant, and that's how easily she was smuggled, probably on a boat no less, and then traveled over to the United States. Interestingly enough, Four Paws Circus was going to try to claim that this was the very first elephant born in America, but because of the rivalry associated between various circuses that I mentioned a minute ago, one of them, in that case being Barnum and Bailey, found out about the deception and then forced Four Paws Circus to admit that, hey, this wasn't the only baby elephant ever born on American soil. They had to claim otherwise, and they had to finally start stating that it was the one that was born outside of a tropical zone. It just shows how kind of petty and things are when it comes to these two businesses and other businesses there. And then what happened, of course, is it impacts the animals themselves, because these circuses just try to outdo each other when it came to the publicity surrounding their animals. So Topsy grew up essentially in that Four Paws Circuses, and she grew up to be pretty large, somewhere around either 20 feet high and then 20 feet long, weighing about 4 to 6 tons altogether. And in those years she ended up gaining a reputation of being known as the bad elephant. I think, though, the way I was reading this information, and let me know if anyone else either agrees or disagrees, it's all about publicity. It's more than the lines of publicity sells. And so when you have a circus that is trying again to make sure that it gets those seats in the chairs, cheeks in the seats as is mentioned in business, that you want to have reputation, and bad reputations sell this kind of stuff. So there were some circumstances that apparently Topsy was involved in that caused her notoriety to spread, and that of course just continued to lead to have big business. People would come in interested in seeing whenever the circus was in town. They wanted to see the notorious Topsy and her bad reputation. So here's some of the instances that occurred. One of them was this. There was a spectator, a guy by the name of James Fielding Blount, and this was maybe sometime around 1902. I got the impression that this must have been someone that went there to that circus, but then wandered off. And like, in other words, found a way to go across certain areas that were restricted, and one of those areas was this. It was a tent that housed the actual elephants themselves from that circus, and there was Topsy tied in a line with some of the elephants there too. And so this spectator, James Fielding Blount, was apparently drunk, like just totally drunk, just obviously there to cause some kind of havoc and so on. And so he started offering first the whiskey that he had to the elephants, and then of course when they weren't responding, he went straight up to Topsy and then used, and again, a lot of this is maybe out there to decide whether it's real or not, because there's not too many witnesses, if there are any at all, but apparently he used a lit cigar, one of those cigars that he'd had, and he used it to burn the tip of it against a trunk that Topsy had. And elephant's trunk is very, very sensitive, so that of course made Topsy just go ballistic, and then she threw this guy straight to the ground, and then either using her head, her knees, or her foot, one of those three, she used him to crush him to death. And so this death occurred, and this was exaggerated even beyond other points, because at the time too, newspapers were also utilizing all of these sensationalistic headlines to make sure that they in turn could sell their newspapers. So it just pretty much goes hand in hand, right? You have these circuses, and then you have these newspapers, both of them stating these things happening because of the elephants, and that in turn just causes more seats to be sold. And so her Topsy's man killings, as they were called, eventually grew and grew. Apparently this was up to 12 men, if you could believe that. But going into more investigations and people trying to research all these killings, they have truly found that it's mainly just been that one, involving the one I just mentioned for James Fielding Blount, and maybe another one there in either Paris or Waco, Texas. But even then, that wouldn't have been a death. Instead, it would have been injury, like somebody that Topsy either attacked or was attacked by this person, and then that caused Topsy to go ballistic one more time. But essentially, that's as far as it goes when it comes to that type of stuff that Topsy was doing, as far as her bad reputation. But again, anything as far as that limited stance, that doesn't sell stuff. So instead, you want to make sure that there was something else there. In fact, here's another example. There was also in 1902 another spectator, a guy by the name of Louis Dodoro, who apparently used a tiny stick in his hand to tickle Topsy behind her ear, and this set her off in such a way that she grabbed the waist of this guy, threw him high into the air, and then before anything else could have happened, her handler stopped the situation, and then that was it. But if you could believe this, next, it looks like Four Paws Circus realized that even with all this notoriety that Topsy was having, they couldn't handle her, so to speak. Like, they wanted to get rid of her because maybe even her and her actions were just too much for them to handle, especially when they had so much other elephants to work with as well. So they ended up selling Topsy to another person, in this case a guy by the name of Paul Boynton, and he was an owner at a location called Sea Lion Park, which was located there in Coney's Island, and she was just added to the roster of animals that were there. And in this case, her animal handler, the one that she had from before, a guy by the name of William Whitey Alt, he came along. In other words, he was hired over from that other location over to this one, and then he was able to handle her. There were some situations though with this handler that I don't know, it seemed like he cared about her in certain situations, but in other situations he was there kind of egging her on and making sure that she claimed and did her bad reputation that she was known for. Like, for example, he was also apparently someone that was drunk a lot of times, and he would use that situation to cause Topsy to ride her out into the public streets, and then of course that freaked people out. And then another situation I was reading was he took Topsy over to a police station, and then there tried to get her inside the police station as well, and that caused the cops to essentially be lock themselves up inside a cell out of protection in order to make sure that they weren't harmed by Topsy. So you can see, even though this was her elephant handler, he in turn was causing these kind of strange circumstances that was almost, I don't know if it was because of the alcohol or because he was a bad man altogether, but he in turn was causing the situations that were again causing Topsy to have a very, very bad reputation. There was even another incident where he tried to stab her with a pitchfork because they were moving from one place to another. If you could believe it, the circuses also used the elephants to move giant things around. So whenever they moved from one location to another, they would tie these things to the elephants, kind of like horses and mules and so forth would do now whenever you use them to move large objects. Such was the case with these elephants. And then when she wasn't budging, he used a pitchfork to stab her with it, but he in turn was confronted by police from it as well. Either way, though, Topsy, during that time period of 1902, for just that year or so, she was there at that new place, but she in turn again caused a little bit of havoc because of everything that was happening to her, and then also because of her notoriety, and even her handler was eventually fired afterward. That culminated all into this, which is, of course, the horrific execution that happened to her. So here's how it occurred. So Topsy, in turn, was leased out, or the park itself was leased out to yet new owners, and this was someone by the name of Frederick Thompson and Elmore Dundee. And when they went there, they in turn wanted to do something new, like they wanted to have something done with the circus to make it bigger and better. That's just the way the business works. Whenever something is sold to a new business, that costs them money, and so they want to make sure that they in turn can recoup their money. And what better way to do so than to make things bigger, better, badder? In other words, they wanted to absolutely gain newspapers' attention. They wanted to sell those seats. They wanted to absolutely make certain that something could be done to do so. And what a way to do it in this case with this. They immediately decided that with everything that Topsy was doing in the past couple of years, everything as far as her bad reputation and everything else that I just mentioned, they wanted to get rid of her, and they couldn't find anybody to do so. If you could believe this, they tried to give her away, and nobody would have been able to say yes to it. It's not that easy, right? Whenever you're just trying to get rid of an elephant, you got to find a special owner. You definitely have to find some kind of special location for the elephant as well. I mean, heaven forbid if you could actually take the elephant back to where it was born and just let it roam free. That's not going to work because that, of course, costs money. So they had to find other alternatives that cost them much, much less. And then that's when finally someone realized, one of them within the actual park realized a sensationalistic way to do so. Why not have Topsy be put to death in a public manner? That's how easy that decision was. They wanted to have something done that was, again, very sensationalistic, and they wanted to be able to collect money from it. And in fact, it was going to be something like 25 cents a head for anyone wanted to see this spectacle. They had to pay for admission to get inside it. And this was all because, again, they wanted to have something done to stand out because they were going to build a huge park there, these new owners at Luna Park, and then they were going to need funds for it, and they were going to have a 200-foot tall electrical tower. They were going to have something there involving Coney Island, like a gigantic set of construction and centerpieces and other type of items there, and all of this would have to be kickstarted. And what better way to do so in their eyes than to have the very public death of Topsy the elephant? They probably used everything that Topsy had unfortunately done these past couple of years as a reasoning, like they were stating, this elephant is too dangerous. We definitely have to take care of some manner of this elephant, and that's probably the reasoning that they used. In other words, to get over their guilt associated with it. And so eventually they decided to select a date. It was going to be, I believe it was either January 3rd at the beginning, but then it moved to the 4th, and they announced it as a public hanging. Imagine that. Imagine how cruel that would have been. Immediately, that brings to mind, of course, Mary the Elephant. Again, something that I mentioned in the other past video. But yes, it was going to be decided as a public hanging until the ASPCA was involved, until they decided to step in and state that no, a public hanging would be, quote unquote, needlessly cruel means of killing Topsy, and that something else would have to be done. I found that a little bit strange because if the idea was that it was needlessly cruel, then why do the actual execution in the first place? And I was also reading this too. They even tried to give the elephant to the ASPCA, but again, it just takes a special circumstance, a special handling to do so. So that wasn't an alternative as well. So there was actually some back and forth. This is another thing that's very hard to believe. There was some decisioning that was done as to the actual method that Topsy would be killed. Ultimately, she would be killed. Like, that was 100% decided, and there was no stopping that, which is, again, it's beyond fathoming whenever it comes to something like that. But yes, how she was going to kill, that was the centerpiece. So it was either a choice between the public hanging, which is, again, something that was going to be stopped up front, or it was going to be electrocution, or it was going to be strangling, or it was going to be poisoning. And eventually, after much negotiation, it was decided that there was going to be a combination of several things. First was going to be a strangling of Topsy herself, and this was going to be using some very, very large ropes, using a steam-powered winch, no less, for it. And then it was going to be followed by poisoning and then electricity at the same time. In other words, if the strangling didn't work. So I'm guessing the difference between a hanging and a strangling is hanging obviously involves being suspended in the air, and as we saw with Mary the elephant, that didn't work out in a horrific manner because of the circumstances that caused to her afterward. And strangling, it gave me the idea that it would be more along the lines of just putting the rope around Topsy the elephant's neck and then just slowly tightening it, and then that was it. Like, have her stand where she stands now, but have that rope tighten around her until she is strangled to death. All, of course, is just very, very gruesome to just read about and realize that this was happening. This is almost like the Twilight Zone when I was reading this information, because how could you have all these three things almost happen at the same time as a surefire way to try to kill Topsy, and how this decision was even done in the first place is just, it's just madness. But still, it was determined that finally January 4th would be the big day. The press was invited. There were 1,500 spectators that apparently paid to be there. There were 100 press photographers that were there as well. Everyone went to that special place there in Coney Island, where again that amusement park or something there was being constructed tied to the new spectacle. And then there were even another set of spectators surrounding the buildings. Those buildings, too, were also charging their own admission to see the execution of Topsy the elephant. All of this was just happening with Topsy being the centerpiece. I mean, as you've seen from these pictures here, she was definitely by herself. There was no one else surrounding her. Her last moments were essentially her being surrounded by all these strangers, none of the other animals that she may have been, I guess, forming some kind of relationships or bonding with there at the circus. She was just led that morning from her cage or wherever she was in that tent over to this area by herself. She must have known too, because apparently she walked with a slow footing of sorts, like she kind of knew what was going on, and this was something that she was not liking at all. There was even some special electric work that was done by the Edison Electric Illuminating Company at the time to make sure that there was a current, an AC alternative current, in other words, that was placed from one area that was like 5 blocks away over to this area. And there was even a special pad. I don't know if they could call it a pad, actually. It was more on the lines of copper line sandals, whatever that means, that would have been tied to Topsy's right foot and then her left front foot. So I'm sorry, it's the other way around. It's right forefoot and then left hind foot to ensure that when she was electrocuted there was a clean current, that there was no way that it would just be stopped in any manner whatsoever. It would just straight go through her to make sure that yes, she dies right away. But yes, Topsy was led to this area, and then she was supposed to cross a bridge, and it was on this bridge that would have led her to that winch, that one that included that rope that would have been tied around her neck. But she sensed again that something was just completely wrong. She forbid herself from crossing over. There was no way that she was going to be pushed over it. There was carrots that were offered, there was apples that were offered as well. This bridge, she knew that if she crossed it, somehow it would lead to her death, and so she absolutely refused to do so. No matter how much prodding people were giving her, she wasn't moving an inch. Even her former handler, remember that guy that I was mentioning earlier that got drunk, that Whitey guy, he was in turn brought on board too to try to lead her across the bridge, but he was like, no, there was nothing that he could do. He was even offered large sums of money for it, but he was like, absolutely not, because even he cared for her enough, and he didn't want to have her brought to her death. In other words, he decided, his exact quote, he didn't want to, quote unquote, bring death to her. And so that steam engine, the one that had the rope and the winch, was just left as is. There was pretty much nothing else that they could do, and so they decided to actually bring death straight to her instead. And so they reattached, or they moved the electrical stuff over to her location. They wired her with the copper line sandals. Again, someone might have to point out what those are. Is that something where it's tied like a electrical rope, if you could call it that, right around her foot, something like that? And then that was going to be her method, the one that she was that they were going to decide on, that she would be facing her death. It would be through electrocution. So they placed it on her. They gave the signal 5 blocks away, and then at 2:45 p.m. the signal was cleared. Oh, it was actually 9 blocks. My apologies. I was reading 5 blocks away from another area, but no, it was actually 9 blocks away. The chief electrician there closed one circuit, opened another switch elsewhere, and then that instantly sent 6,600 volts instantly just streaming from one location to another right to her area. And when that happened, 10 seconds, that's all that took, 10 seconds for her to suddenly be stood still. Like, there's actually a footage of her death there that's out there. You can find it on Wikipedia if you truly want to see it, and I'm sure it's out there on YouTube somewhere. But you can see that within 10 seconds time, that's all it took for her to topple to the ground, stiff as a board, and then that was it. And even then, the reason why she stood there at the beginning was because they were feeding her carrots, but these carrots were actually lined with 460 grams of potassium cyanide. I was mentioning earlier that she was going to be poisoned at the same time too. So that's essentially what was occurring. They gave her this carrot, and she was eating it just nonchalantly, thinking it was probably just a little treat, not knowing, of course, that that poison would go against her in a little bit. But this electricity, it was truly the one that was determined that killed Topsy. She ended up dying right then and there. And to make things even more gruesome, when she toppled over that winch that was eventually moved over to her with the rope, and the rope was attached to her neck, and it was tightened for another 10 minutes just to make sure that she was 100% absolutely dead. Not only that, but 2 nooses were tied against her as well, and that was when she was truly decided that she was pronounced dead. It was at 2:47 p.m., 2 minutes later, in fact, after the electrocution started, that's when she was determined she was dead. And it was investigated and found out that yes, it was truly tied to the electricity itself, not the strangling and not the poisoning. But again, it goes to show they did all 3 things at once. She was electrocuted, she was poisoned, and then she was strangled all at once to ensure that Topsy the elephant was ultimately killed. Just flat out horrific. Just reading this information, here was someone, in this case, a beautiful animal, born out in the wild, but immediately just captured by these elephant traders and then smuggled here into the U.S. and then grew up in that area involving that circus, and then just having the circus trying to make sure that they could create this quote-unquote bad elephant to get the reputation to sell seats. It worked. They definitely got the elephant with that notoriety. Her finding out, like in terms of these circumstances with these drunk spectators, and also having a drunk handler as well, causing these situations with her creating her own havoc to protect herself because of what was happening to her. But that just continued with her reputation, and then finally causing it to, in turn, being sold from one place to another, and then that new place deciding they're not going to handle her anymore. And what better way to get rid of her than to decide, in their perspective, that they're going to ultimately kill her for the creation of the new park. In other words, to sell the venue of the new park, and then have it be witnessed by all these spectators and filmed ultimately by some of the spectators or some of the media company there. Just all around, there are no winners, absolutely no winners with this ultimate and tragic story involving Topsy the elephant. If you ever wanted to about the film itself, there's some notoriety tied to that too, because apparently there was the Edison company that was filming it at the time. They were using it for these kinetoscopes where they would start shooting it, like in other words, shooting that film and then placing it across various locations throughout the U.S. It's one of those machines, I guess, where you put that coin in and you can see those moving pictures for a couple of seconds, and that's how it was sold as. Well, apparently, and just through happenstance, that clip, because it was submitted to, I think it was the U.S. Congress, in other words, a Library of Congress, in order for preservation or copyright purposes, because that exists, that's pretty much the only reason why people talk about Topsy today, because if it wasn't for that, then pretty much she would almost be lost in time. There would be very little documentation about what occurred to her, but because that's still in existence, it's because it's still there in the Library of Congress, people have rediscovered Topsy's story over the years. In fact, there has been memorials placed to her. There was at Coney Island, there was a mermaid, like a parade float that was commemorated to her. Some artists as well developed competitions to make sure that they could create a piece tied to her memorial as well. The clip in of itself has been featured in multiple documentaries too about Coney Island, and of course the notoriety that happened there with the circuses and Topsy's death. And then also with Thomas Edison himself, there was some notoriety on that part because people were stating, was he or wasn't he involved? But everything is to the point that he wasn't. He had sold his shares years back from the company, and he wasn't even involved with the filming stuff involving that company itself that did, I think, like 2,500 something plus films. He wasn't involved in any of them, so he wouldn't have had any kind of notoriety. And there was also someone I mentioned in the comments too before that there was the AC/DC wars, like when it came to electrical companies and how that could have played a role in it too. But apparently there's not much tied to that as well. But again, none of it compares to the tragedy associated with Topsy the elephant and what occurred to her right from the beginning all the way to her unfortunate death, all of it ending with just a horrific spectacle, just to be able to get people to see these seats and then also be able to have this stuff witnessed by so many people there. But if anyone has any more information, anything else might have missed, please post those comments below. Anybody been there to the Coney Island area and seen something like a memorial or something else tied to this beautiful animal, to Topsy the elephant? Please let me know. This is just a very bad, very unfortunate thing. Again, having this elephant just have so much bad things happen in her short life and then ultimately end in such a horrific manner. So that's why I do these videos here, because I want to commemorate this beautiful animal and make sure that once again people are reminded of her, and then ensure that her memory stands out going forward for who knows how much longer. But again, if anybody has any more info on this, then please post those comments below. Anything else I want to miss too that's very, very important, then also please share it as well too below. So alright everybody, thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.